The medal the United States pins on its wounded today, the one handed to soldiers hurt in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in conflicts that no one in 1945 could have imagined, was very likely manufactured for a battle that never took place. Somewhere in an American supply system, there is still a reserve of Purple Hearts struck during the Second World War. And the reason the reserve has lasted so long is that it was built for a catastrophe. In the final year of the war against Japan, American planners did not expect the fighting to end with 2 bombs and a broadcast. They expected to invade the home islands of Japan directly, in the largest amphibious operation ever conceived, larger than the landings at Normandy, against an enemy that had decided to defend its own soil to the last. And they expected the cost to be so staggering that they ordered the medals in advance, 500,000 of them, certain they would need every. This is the story of that invasion, the one that was prepared for, paid for in advance, and then never came.
The plan had a name that captured its ambition with grim simplicity. It was called Operation Downfall, and it was the master design for the conquest of Japan itself. By the middle of 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached the threshold of the home islands. Okinawa had fallen after a battle of appalling cost. The Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. American bombers were burning the cities of the home islands almost without opposition. And yet, Japan had not surrendered. And the men planning the end of the war could see no clear path to a surrender that did not involve setting foot on Japanese ground. So they built the plan to do exactly that. Downfall was not a single landing, nor a raid, nor a limited lodgment on an outlying island. It was a 2-stage campaign, conceived to be executed across the better part of a year, that would put millions of Allied troops onto the most heavily defended coastline the war had yet produced, against an enemy fighting on its own home ground, with nothing left to lose. It was the plan to finish the war by force, on Japanese soil, whatever the cost of doing so. The first stage had its own name. It was called Operation Olympic.
Operation Olympic was the assault on Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's 4 main islands, and it was scheduled for the 1st of November, 1945. The objective was not to conquer all of Kyushu, but to seize its southern third, the beaches, the ports, the airfields, and to turn that captured ground into an enormous staging base for the second and far larger blow that would follow. The scale of Olympic alone is difficult to absorb. The plan called for 14 divisions to come ashore across the southern beaches of Kyushu, supported by a fleet of a size the Pacific had never assembled in one place, including the bulk of the American and British carrier strength, and an armada of transports and landing craft stretching beyond the horizon. By comparison, the Normandy landings of the previous year, the largest the war in Europe had seen, had put roughly 5 divisions ashore on the first day. Olympic, on its opening day, was meant to land nearly 3 times that number. And even so, it was meant only to be the opening act, the lodgment from which the decisive stroke would be launched the following spring. That decisive stroke had a name of its own.
The second stage was Operation Coronet, and it was the one that would have ended the war on the ground. Coronet was the invasion of Honshu, the main island of Japan, aimed directly at the Kanto Plain, the broad coastal lowland that holds Tokyo and the heart of the nation. It was scheduled for the spring of 1946, around the 1st of March, once the airfields and ports captured on Kyushu had been built up to support it. Coronet was to be larger than Olympic, larger than any operation in the history of warfare. A landing east and south of Tokyo by an even greater force, intended to drive across the plain, take the capital, and break the back of Japanese resistance at its center. Taken together, Olympic and Coronet, the 2 halves of Downfall, would have committed the United States and its allies to a campaign on the Japanese mainland lasting well into 1946 and possibly beyond. And the men who planned it knew that the enemy was waiting, that the Japanese had guessed almost exactly where the first blow would fall, and that they had built a plan of their own to meet it.
While the Americans drew up downfall, the Japanese high command was building its answer, and they called it Ketsugo, the plan for the decisive battle of the homelands. The premise of Ketsugo was that Japan could no longer win the war in any conventional sense, but that it might still inflict losses so severe on an invading force that the Allies would prefer a negotiated end to a final, total bloodletting. The strategy was not victory. It was to make the price of victory unbearable. And the planners of Ketsugo had done something the Americans deeply feared. They had read the map the same way the Americans had. They understood that southern Kyushu offered the only beaches within reach of the airfields and ports an invader would need, and they concluded correctly that the first landing would come there. So rather than spreading their dwindling strength across the whole of Japan, they concentrated it precisely where they expected the enemy to come ashore. The very secrecy that protects most defensive plans was here, beside the point. Both sides were planning the same battle, on the same beaches, at nearly the same time. The defense of Kyushu was built in depth and built to bleed. Through the summer of 1945, Japanese forces fortified the southern beaches and the high ground behind them, digging tunnels into the hills, sighting artillery to cover the landing grounds, and moving division after division into the threatened region, until the garrison of Kyushu had grown far beyond what American intelligence had first estimated. As the buildup continued, American analysts watching the island grew alarmed. The enemy was reinforcing exactly the ground Olympic was meant to take, and the ratio of attackers to defenders that the plan assumed was steadily eroding. The Japanese intent was not to hold a line at the water's edge and break, as garrisons had broken on the smaller islands, but to absorb the landing, contain it, and grind it down in a prolonged battle of attrition on ground they knew and had prepared. Every cave, every ridge, every fortified village was meant to extract a cost. The lesson of Okinawa, where a dug-in defense had inflicted enormous casualties before it fell, was the model. Kyushu was to be Okinawa on a vastly greater scale.
But the heart of Ketsugo was the air weapon, and here the plan took on its most desperate shape. Japan had been expending its aircraft and its trained pilots in conventional combat and in the kamikaze attacks of the previous campaigns. For the defense of the homeland, the High Command made a different choice. They began to hold their aircraft back, thousands of them, of every type, including obsolete trainers, and to reserve them almost entirely for suicide attacks against the invasion fleet. The reasoning was brutal in its arithmetic. A pilot of modest skill in an old aircraft could not survive a dogfight, but he could still be aimed at a ship. Massed against the crowded transports and landing craft of an invasion fleet, packed with troops in the vulnerable hours of an amphibious assault, even a fraction of these aircraft getting through could produce slaughter. The plan envisioned waves of suicide aircraft, supported by suicide boats and human-guided weapons, thrown against the fleet in the first days of the landing, not to defeat it at sea, but to drown a portion of the invasion force before it ever reached the beach.
And the defense did not stop with the military. The Japanese government, facing the prospect of foreign armies on the home islands for the first time in the nation's history, began to prepare the civilian population for a role in the fighting. Measures were put in place to mobilize much of the adult population into a national volunteer combat force, organized to support the army and, if it came to it, to resist the invader with whatever was at hand. Improvised weapons, drill with bamboo spears, the expectation that ordinary people would fight rather than yield. Whether this mobilization would have produced effective resistance or simply a vast civilian catastrophe is a question that, mercifully, was never tested. But it shaped the calculations on both sides. To the Japanese planners, it was the final expression of the resolve to make the homeland uninvadable at any acceptable cost. To the American planners, studying the same intelligence, it meant something colder and more frightening. That a landing on Japan would not be a battle against an army, but
but a battle against a whole society that had been told to die in place. And that recognition fed directly into the numbers.
The question that consumed the planners of downfall was the one no one could answer with confidence. How many men would it cost? Estimating the casualties of an invasion that had not yet happened was as much an act of judgment as of arithmetic, and the men who attempted it produced a range of figures rather than a single number. Some estimates, drawn from the experience of earlier island battles and the rate of loss they had produced, projected American casualties in the tens of thousands for the first stage alone. Others, looking at the scale of the Japanese buildup on Kyushu and the ferocity of the defense expected, ran far higher, into the hundreds of thousands of American dead and wounded for the campaign as a whole, with some of the grimmest projections reaching toward 1 million Allied casualties before Japan was subdued. The figures were disputed at the time, and have been disputed ever since, because they rested on assumptions that could not be confirmed. But the disagreement was never about whether the cost would be terrible. It was only about how terrible. Every serious estimate pointed to a bloodletting without precedent in the American experience of the war.
It is worth pausing on why the estimates climbed so high, because the reasoning reveals what the planners truly feared. The battles that had brought the Americans to the threshold of Japan had each been costlier than the last. On the island of Iwo Jima, the defenders had fought from tunnels and caves until almost none remained, and they had inflicted heavy losses doing it. On Okinawa, close enough to the home islands to be considered Japanese soil, a dug-in defense had held for nearly 3 months and produced casualties on a scale that shook the men planning what would come next. Now the planners were contemplating not a small island or a single outlying province, but the home islands themselves, defended by an enemy fighting on its own ground, reinforced beyond expectation, holding back thousands of suicide aircraft, and preparing to throw its civilian population into the battle. Every factor that had made the earlier battles costly was present here in a magnified form. The planners looked at that combination and concluded that the invasion of Japan would be the bloodiest single undertaking in the history of American armies.
And here is where the abstraction of a casualty estimate became something physical, something you could hold in your hand. The Purple Heart is the decoration the United States awards to those wounded or killed in action. And an army that expects to suffer casualties must have the medals ready to issue. Anticipating the losses that downfall was projected to produce, the American military ordered the manufacture of a vast quantity of Purple Hearts in advance, close to 500,000 of them by the most widely cited accounting, struck and stockpiled against the casualties the invasion of Japan was expected to generate. It was an act of grim logistics, no different in principle from stockpiling ammunition or bandages. If you are certain you will need 500,000 medals, you produce 500,000 medals. The order was placed. The medals were struck. And then, in August of 1945, and here is where the abstraction of a casualty estimate became something physical, something you could hold in your hand. The Purple Heart is the decoration the United States awards to those wounded or killed in action. And an army that expects to suffer casualties must have the medals ready to issue. Anticipating the losses that downfall was projected to produce, the American military ordered the manufacture of a vast quantity of Purple Hearts in advance, close to 500,000 of them by the most widely cited accounting, struck and stockpiled against the casualties the invasion of Japan was expected to generate. It was an act of grim logistics, no different in principle from stockpiling ammunition. What happened to that stockpile is the detail that turns a war plan into something that still touches the present. The medals were not melted down or discarded. They were kept. And because the invasion that would have consumed them never came, the reserve was so enormous that the United States military found it had medals enough to last for generations. In every conflict the country has fought since, Korea, Vietnam,
The Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan. Soldiers wounded in action have been awarded Purple Hearts, and a substantial share of those medals are widely held to have come from the stockpile manufactured in 1945 for the invasion of Japan. The supply was so deep that decades of subsequent wars did not exhaust it. There is a quiet, terrible meaning buried in that fact. The medals pinned to the wounded of conflicts fought half a century and more after the Second World War were made for a battle that the men who ordered them expected to kill 1 million people. The invasion never came, but the evidence that it was expected, the physical proof of how catastrophic it was meant to be, has outlasted nearly everyone who planned it.
The reason the invasion never came is the most consequential fact of the war's end, and it arrived in the first half of August 1945. While the armies on both sides made their final preparations for a battle scheduled to begin in November, the war was brought to a close by other means. 2 atomic bombs were used against Japanese cities in the space of 3 days, with a destructive power that no defensive plan had been built to withstand. At nearly the same moment, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and swept into Manchuria, eliminating the last faint hope in Tokyo of a negotiated peace brokered through Moscow. The 2 blows together, the new weapon and the new enemy, collapsed the assumptions on which the defense of the homeland rested. Japan had prepared to make the cost of invasion unbearable. It had not, and could not have, prepared for an enemy that no longer needed to invade in order to destroy. Within days, the Japanese government moved toward a decision that had been unthinkable through years of war: to accept surrender rather than fight the decisive battle it had been dying to prepare.
The surrender did not come without one last convulsion, and it is worth remembering how close the decisive battle came to happening anyway. Within the Japanese government and high command, the decision to surrender was bitterly contested. There were those who believed that even after the bombs, the homeland defense should go forward, that Ketsugo should be allowed to run its terrible course, that one great battle on the beaches of Kyushu might yet win better terms than capitulation. The argument for surrender prevailed only narrowly, and only with the direct intervention of the emperor. And even then, a faction attempted to seize the palace and stop the surrender broadcast before it could be made. Had that effort succeeded, or had the decision gone the other way, the armies waiting on Kyushu would have met that November exactly as both sides had planned. The medals would have been issued. The estimates would have been tested against reality. The invasion that history records as the great battle that never happened was in the second week of August 1945, a matter of days and a single contested decision away from happening after all.
When the surrender held, the enormous machinery of downfall was stood down. The fleets that had been gathering for the assault on Kyushu were redirected. The divisions that had been training and staging for the November landing were turned instead toward occupation duty. And the men who had expected to fight their way ashore against suicide aircraft and fortified beaches came to Japan unopposed, stepping onto the same ground that Operation Coronet was to have taken by storm. The transformation was abrupt and total. A plan that had occupied the full energy of Allied strategy, that had set in motion the production of medals and landing craft and the movement of armies across the Pacific, simply ceased to be needed. It was filed away, its maps and timetables and casualty projections consigned to the archives. A complete and detailed design for the greatest battle of the war, a battle that, because of 2 weeks in August, was never fought. What survives of it now is paper, and the stockpile of medals, and the haunting exercise of imagining what the autumn of 1945 would have been had the war not ended when it did.
That exercise, imagining the invasion that never came, is not idle, because the shadow of downfall fell across the most consequential decision of the war and has shaped the argument about it ever since. The casualties projected for the invasion of Japan became, in the years that followed, the central justification offered for the use of the atomic bombs. The claim that however terrible the bombs had been, they had spared both nations a far greater toll on the beaches of Kyushu and the Kanto plain. That argument has been debated by historians for as long as the records have been open, contested in its numbers and its assumptions, defended and attacked with equal conviction. It is not the purpose of this account to settle it. What matters here is that the debate itself rests on the plan we have been describing. That to weigh the end of the war at all, you have to weigh it against Operation Downfall, against Ketsugo, against the battle that was prepared and never fought. The invasion that did not happen is, in this sense, one of the most important events of the war. It is the thing against which everything else is measured.
There is something singular about a battle that exists only in its preparations. Most of what we know about war, we know from what happened, from the landings that were made, the lines that broke, the names that became the names of cemeteries. Operation Downfall left none of that. There is no beach where it was fought, no anniversary of its first day, no roll of the dead it produced. It exists entirely in the documents of its planning and in the things that were made for it and never used. And yet, it may have been, in its consequences, more important than many battles that were actually fought. It set the terms of the war's ending. It shaped the decision to use the most terrible weapon ever made. It put into the supply system of a nation a reserve of metals so vast that the wounded of unborn wars would one day wear them. A battle that never happened reached forward across 80 years to touch soldiers who were not yet born when it was planned. Few real battles can claim as much.
The medals are the part of the story that refuses to stay in the past, and that is why they are worth dwelling on. A casualty estimate is an abstraction. It can be argued about, revised, dismissed. But a medal is a physical object, struck in metal, that exists because someone in 1945 looked at the plan for invading Japan and concluded, with enough certainty to commit a factory to it, that this many men would be hurt or killed. The stockpile is the estimate made tangible. It is the bloodletting of downfall, converted into a number of medals, and then frozen in time when the bloodletting did not occur. Every Purple Heart drawn from that reserve in the decades since carries invisibly the assumption that produced it, that the war would end on the beaches of Kyushu, at a cost so high the country had to prepare its honors for the dead in advance. The reserve has outlasted the men who ordered it, the enemy it was meant for, and the war it belonged to. It is, in the most literal sense, the surviving physical proof of the catastrophe that the end of the war created.
And there is a final meaning in the fact that downfall was never fought. One that is easy to miss because it concerns an absence rather than an event. The two stages of the plan, Olympic and Coronet, would together have killed an enormous number of people. American, Allied, and Japanese, soldier and civilian alike. In a campaign whose worst projections reached into the millions when the Japanese side is counted. The end of the war foreclosed all of it. Whatever one concludes about how the war was ended, and that is an argument that will never be fully settled, the invasion of the home islands stands as the measure of what was not paid. The cities that were not yet battlegrounds, the divisions that became occupation troops instead of casualties, the 500,000 medals that were never issued for their intended purpose. All of it is the negative space left by a battle that the world came within days of fighting. The most consequential thing about Operation Downfall is that it remained a plan. The proof of how close it came is still sitting, 80 years later, in a stockpile that has not run out.
The invasion of Japan was prepared, paid for, and then erased by a surrender that arrived just in time. But the surrender was only the beginning of the reckoning, not the end of it. Once the home islands were occupied rather than invaded, the victors turned to a different kind of battle,
not for ground, but for accountability. The men who had led Japan into the war, who had ordered its campaigns and overseen its conduct, were to be brought before a court in Tokyo and made to answer with their lives. And the most prominent of them, the wartime leader who more than any other had embodied the militarist state, would attempt to deny his accusers their judgment by taking his own life before he could be tried, only to be saved deliberately by the very enemy that intended to hang him. We have seen in this series how the scientists of Unit 731 escaped justice because they were useful. Next on Torah Files, the opposite story. The man the Americans refused to let die, kept alive so that he could be condemned, in the trial that was meant to close the book on the war. Torah Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese side, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.